So with the draft about a week away, today we're going to look at the point guard position. Throughout the next week, we'll be looking at every position and kind of detailing, giving a primer of what to expect if your team is in need of a certain position. Today, like I said, we're going to look at point guards. And it's not really a deep point guard class, if you think about it. It's pretty top-heavy. You got three guys who are probably going to go in the lottery in Ja Morant, Darius Garland, and Kobe White. So we'll talk about them. But other than that, it's not really a class ripe in point guards, as in contrast to what next year's draft will be, which should feature guys like Cole Anthony and Nico Mannion, LaMelo Ball, and a number of international prospects next year as well. But this year, it's kind of top-heavy. So we're kind of going to look at, 10 to 15, maybe 20 different point guards in the class and talk about what they bring to the team, what system would be best for them, and what they really need to do between now and the start of next season to not only make a roster but become a rotation player. So at the top, obviously, we're going to look at Ja Morant out of Murray State. Consensus top point guard in the class, had one of the biggest rises of any player I've seen in recent memory. I remember in the NCAA tournament a year ago when they played against West Virginia, I ended up picking Murray State in part because of Morant and his teammate, Jonathan Stark, I believe his name was, and they were both excellent. Morant was only a freshman, but that was a really dangerous backcourt. They ended up losing that game, but I would have never expected the jump that I've seen and that really everybody saw in Ja Morant from kind of being, a triple-double threat as a freshman no one really knew about, to then showing out at summer camps, and then last season emerging as one of the best point guards we've seen in the last 10 years or so coming out of college. So I think for Morant, you look at his athleticism and his explosion, and that really sets him apart of guys at this point, because the rest of this draft class is not full of athletic point guards. If you really look at the list, it's a lot of guys who have good skill sets. A lot of them are really good at one thing. Morant's a really all-around point guard. I mean, he can get to the basket at will, rise up, dunk on somebody, long, not as active as a defender as you'd like, but some of that might have just been conserving energy. He has potential there, and he's smart. But what I think is the most special gift for him is his vision and passing ability. This is a guy who is 6'3", but can see the whole court, and is the type of player and a playmaker that can just pass guys open. There's a difference between finding an open man and actually being able to make guys open. And it's a little fine distinction that you really only know when you see it. So like Kawhi Leonard, for example, passes to guys who are open. But LeBron James passes guys open. So even if they don't have, necessarily an open shot right away, he can lead you with passes, and just the way that he can orchestrate will allow him to get people open shots. And Ja Morant kind of has that potential in terms of his vision. And that's why he led the country in assists, because with the guy that explosive and that good at finishing, he's crafty around the rim. He can finish through contact, up and unders, anything you want, Euro steps, floaters, runners, all that. And when a guy can do that much damage at the rim, you don't really have a choice but to send help. So when he's going to pass like that and is in a more spaced out system, which I think at this point it's safe to say Memphis will be picking him. So now what does that look like? Because with all these point guards, we're going to look at the best situation. For Morant, best situation might not even matter because we know he's going to Memphis. So in Memphis, he's going to be in a situation where there's a lot of players around him who are not necessarily great shooters or, talented players from NBA standards. I mean, they got the number 2 pick for a reason. I don't know if Mike Conley will be there. I think if he stays, I've said this on multiple occasions, I think Mike Conley is a type of selfless competitor who is not going to take it personally and is going to understand. I mean, he's also still getting his $30 or so million a year, so I'm sure it won't kill him. As a competitor, he's going to want to play a lot, but bringing up a guy like Morant's not going to ruin team chemistry. So it's going to be Morant. Let's say best case scenario, it's Morant and Conley. And then what do you have other than that at the 3? I mean, I think you'll probably have Kyle Anderson maybe. At the 4, you got a budding star in Jaren Jackson. So I think that combination of Morant and Jackson is going to be what's going to elevate them to the level they want to be in the long term. That might be one of the best young duos you can have in terms of a guard and a postman. And then Valanciunas will probably still be back. So that's not a playoff team, I wouldn't say. But for Morant, he's going to be able to make an impact right away because he's obviously incredibly gifted. And it's one of those situations where I could talk on and on about all his abilities. He can rebound, pass. Not a great shooter. He's got work to do there. But he's got a lot of talent. And not just that, he's got high IQ and great work ethic. And he's determined to be a great of all time, really. So I think Memphis is going to be a fine situation for him. It's not going to be too many bright lights. Not that he couldn't handle those, but there's probably not going to be all that external drama in Memphis as opposed to going to New York or an LA. But I think he's clearly the number 1 point guard. But then at number 2, I think this can be up for debate. To me, right now, I have Darius Garland as the 7th overall prospect. And I have Kobe White from North Carolina as number 8. So I'll start with Darius Garland. Had a meniscus injury, missed the whole second half of the college basketball season, really part of the first half as well. But he was the top point guard in his high school class. He went to Vanderbilt with lofty expectations, and when he played, he was really good. Shot around 40% from 3, good free throw shooter, really solid shot maker. One of those guys that can create his shot off the dribble, but also hit outside shots off the dribble, which in today's NBA, if you look at guys like Steph Curry or James Harden or even Trae Young last year, when you have guys that can come off of a screen and just create behind the three-point line, it's a huge asset and opens everything up. And Darius Garland has that ability as a shot maker from the outside. Now, he's slight. He's only about 175 pounds. He might have put on some weight in the pre-draft process, but he's not a big guard. He's only about 6'2". He has decent length, but he's not a guy who is going to tower over you, and size is not his strength. But his IQ and his intangibles and a way that he feels out what he needs to do are really off the charts. He's a highly intelligent player and just person in general. He knows what he's doing. He doesn't really waste movements offensively. He's going to look really good in pick and rolls because, like I said, he can shoot the lights out and he can get to the basket if he needs to. Now, I think he's going to struggle initially getting points up over some of the posts he's going to see because he's not really a good athlete. He's definitely below the rim finisher. He has a pretty quick first step, so that helps a lot. But he doesn't do a lot around the rim that's going to wow you. He's really going to have to work on getting incredibly consistent with that floater and using his body a little bit better. I'd like to see him more when he beats guys, kind of hold them off more than he does. But again, he's 18, 19 years old. He's got plenty of learning to do. So I'm not too concerned about that. Now, in terms of fit, I think the teams that need point guards are really the Suns and the Bulls. So as a Bulls fan, I would have loved to see Ja Morant in a Bulls jersey. But I think Darius Garland is probably going to Phoenix at number 6. I think if he slides that far, people had said the Lakers, I don't really see that, especially if you keep Lonzo. Now, it's looking more and more likely that that pick is going to be shipped off. That 4 picks are going to be shipped off for Anthony Davis. So the whole discussion would be different, obviously. But I think Darius Garland's most likely to go to 6 to the Suns, where they'd be able to pair him up with Devin Booker, with DeAndre Ayton, and just have a really good mix of guys. Because point guard is something they have mismanaged as bad as anybody. You had a point where they had Eric Bledsoe, Isaiah Thomas, and Goran Dragic, if I remember correctly. And you somehow managed to not only let them all go, but you didn't really get much for them. Just poor management of the point guards, and the organization as a whole has struggled with finding the right players. So Garland would be a great fit for them. Smart, can play really with anybody, can play on and off the ball. If you want to give Book a little more freedom, bring the ball up. But I think the change between Garland and Kobe White, there's not that much space there. And that's why I said I have Kobe White as the number 3 point guard, number 8 overall prospect. And I have Kobe White going number 7 to the Bulls. And I think in terms of just up and down the court speed, I've said this all year, I think Kobe White is the most blinding open court sprinter with the ball. He's just lightning fast. Reminds me of De'Aaron Fox with the way he goes up and down the court. And obviously with his hair, it looks like he's going a lot faster. I mean, he's probably 6'5", which is already huge. If you add the hair, he might be like 6'9". So Kobe White is a big guard, but he's also fast. He's faster than, I would argue with the ball, he's faster than Ja Morant from what I've seen. Or maybe it just looks like that because of the way he moves, but Kobe White's a blur. And on top of that, he can make shots from all 3 levels. He is a guy who has really done a good job of mastering that step back from either direction, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you play a lot of basketball, you know most guys like to shoot their step back going to their non-strong hand. So if I'm a righty, which I am, I'm more comfortable going to my left hand, separating, and then getting a step back off that way. Kobe White is a guy who can make that going right, and he's a right-handed guy. And he just does a little subtle, like kind of jab step in and out, and can get enough space to get that shot off. And at 6'5", you're not blocking him anyway. But I just think for Kobe White, it's going to be a matter of fit, and I want him to go to a team like the Bulls where he's just going to get to run. I think Kobe White got better as a playmaker, but he did come into North Carolina as a scoring guard, highest scorer in North Carolina history. He's an absolute bucket, and you can't argue that. But in terms of the details of playing point guard, so setting up an offense and knowing where to get your guys the shots that they like to get, and really just playing at a consistent pace. Change of pace for Kobe White is going to determine if he's just a solid role player or if he's a starter in the NBA. Because to me, he looks like a 6'5" version of Lou Williams with the way that he can score. And that's if he's in the right situation. Because he is pretty long as well at 6'5". He can do whatever he wants offensively in terms of putting the ball in the basket, and he has better vision than he gets credit for. But I would like to see him get a little more consistent with his IQ of the players around him and understanding when they need the ball. But he got a lot better during his time in North Carolina. And for that, you have to applaud him because that's not an easy thing to do as a freshman in the ACC. But I don't think Kobe White could find a better situation maybe than the Bulls, because the Bulls have a need at that position. Again, as I've said on multiple podcasts already, I still think Chris Dunn could be a starter in the NBA. I think he needs that full summer to evaluate him fairly. But Kobe White is a guy who can run. He can get out and go, and you see him running with Zach LaVine and Otto Porter on the wings. And then you got Lauri Markkanen, Wendell Carter, also love to run, get up and down. It's a lineup of guys who can shoot the ball, who can score the ball. And defensively, Kobe White doesn't get enough credit either. He's good at defense when he wants to be. And I know that people are probably like, well, how long does he want to be? Because a lot of young players don't really want to commit to that. But he can do a lot of things on the defensive end. And I think people are just going to need to give him time, as you do with any of these guys. There's not a lot of guys who come into the league ready to defend NBA point guards. It's way more ball screens, handoffs, all that, switches. Some of these guys don't really know how to guard in switches. But Kobe White's 6'5", so we're going to give him a little more of an edge over these other guys, like even Garland and Morant, in terms of handling switches, because he's a big, strong guy. But I think the Bulls are perfect for him. And at number 8 overall, I could see him going to the Suns maybe, but I don't really think he would be picked above Darius Garland for most people. I think if you look at some of the other teams that have picks, I always thought Minnesota would be a good fit for Kobe White because they're another team that the point guard position's kind of foggy, kind of aging. Derrick Rose probably not going to be back. So you really have space there for him to play. But he could start right away in Chicago. But then after number 8, so after the number 3 point guard, but number 8 overall in my top 100, the next point guard I have is Carson Edwards, and that's all the way at 26. So if you're a team that wants a point guard, or you're a fan who feels you need a point guard, and you want a starter, you got 3 options for the most part. So you either got to trade up, or what I have really thought about, even for the Bulls, is you say, let me take who I think the top guy is. And at 7, I think Kobe White would realistically be that. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to be so adamantly focused on picking for need and pick a point guard in this class. Other positions maybe. Not a point guard in this class, because the point guards in the next class have superstar potential. Cole Anthony could be a top 5 point guard in the NBA. Nico Mannion, LaMelo Ball, Phil Melion, Killian Hayes from France. There's going to be a lot of options. And plus you got guys like Trey Jones and Ashton Hagans who are solid, who are probably going to be coming out next year after deciding to return. But Carson Edwards is a guy who I'm just set on Carson Edwards going to the Warriors in the first round. Because if you watch what they have, no offense to Quinn Cook, but they don't have a guy who can go get his bucket off the bench. Who on their bench is a shot maker? I'm trying to look at who they have, because you got Quinn Cook when you have everybody healthy, right? So let's say we got KD in with everybody else. You have Iggy then, because he used to come off the bench. Not really a scorer at this point anymore. And then you have guys like, Damian Jones and Alfonso McKinney. You don't really have guys who can score. Carson Edwards, after the NCAA tournament run, to me is a lock to be a first-round pick. Now, he wouldn't be a mid-first rounder. Don't expect him to go before 15 in the draft. Expect him to be more in that 20 to 25. I have him going to the Warriors later at around, 28. But don't expect him to go above 15. It'd be a reach, I think, if he did, because he is a miniature point guard. But when you look at what smaller guards have done in the last 5 or so years, guys like even Fred VanVleet, if you're tough, if you can make shots, especially on the perimeter, and if you are smart, you can find a role and also be an impact player. And Carson Edwards is built like a running back or defensive back, and has as good an elevation as any of these point guards. Kobe White gets up on his jump shot, but Carson Edwards at 6 foot, you never know. And he's a long 6-footer. He has good wingspan, very solidly built, as I said. Not a great playmaker. To me, Carson Edwards is a scoring point guard. So I wouldn't call him a 2, but I would say he's a scoring point guard who, when he's coming off that screen, he's looking to score. Now, teams are going to try to post him up. They're going to try to force switches. And because he's 6 feet tall, like you see with most miniature guards, they're going to try to take advantage of him that way. And maybe that's why Carson Edwards won't be a starter in the NBA. But even if he's not, when you look at the history of guys coming off the bench, a lot of times the most explosive ones are those, 6 foot to 6'3" guards you can pull in off the bench, maybe put with a bigger 2, and just let them go crazy in the second unit. And I think Carson Edwards can be that guy because he is that good scoring the ball. And we saw him struggle sometimes with shot selection. Field goal percentage was all over the place. And I remember as a freshman when I first saw him, his toughness stood out even above his shot making. Because when he was a freshman, he was on a team of a bunch of guys that were already ready. You look at guys like Vince Edwards and Caleb Swanigan, Isaac Haas. They had a bunch of guys who were already playing. But Carson Edwards was just tough, straight toughness. And everything he did looked like he was doing it with a purpose, and it never looked wasted. Now, as he got older, he had to take tougher shots. This year was an all Big Ten player. He had guys swarming him, though. He had to take shots that were bad shots or will be bad shots in the NBA just because of how the team was structured. And it's nothing against him. Those are hard shots to make. But in the tournament, he showed you what he can be. and that's a bucket, and that's who he is. So if he goes to a team like the Warriors, I don't think anyone should pick Carson Edwards if you're not going to let him play free. If you let him play free off your bench, he's a guy who can score. And that's just the truth. So we'll have to see who takes him. But again, the drop off between Kobe White and Carson Edwards is at least 10 picks or so to me. So teams and fans wanting point guards, please be aware, don't expect to get yourself a starter outside of those top three. And after Edwards, I got Ty Jerome, who a year ago, I probably would have said there's no chance he leaves Virginia early. And it's not because he's not good. He's 6'5". He's a legit 6'5", a good defender, as you can expect from Virginia. Very smart player, knows where to go, doesn't have a shifty handle necessarily. You know, he can kind of have guys who are shorter get up under him and frustrate him. But he's a great shooter, and shooting has always been his thing. He's a guy who has a quick release and can get it off from wherever you want him to shoot it from. All around, doesn't matter, doesn't really have a spot where he's going to struggle from the outside. And good he could be. I think as a sophomore, it was a lot of him kind of playing the playmaker role and not as much of a shot-making position, because you had Kyle Guy, who, you know, has been really, if we talk about accomplishments, is the most accomplished player on that Virginia team, even more so than DeAndre Hunter. But Ty Jerome this year stood out because of how well and consistently he competed, defended, and made shots. And he's also a guy who is going to become a good post-up player if he can continue playing that point guard position, because he can guard point guards. He can guard twos, may be able to guard some threes, moves his feet very well, is active with his hands, gets a lot of steals. And when he had a mismatch, he had no problem. If a guy is quicker and shorter than him, no problem taking a couple dribbles in, turning his back to the guy, and just going to work, because he can hit those turnarounds, especially over his right shoulder. So I think Ty Jerome is a guy who is going to flirt with the first round. Maybe I have him going to Milwaukee right now with the 30th pick. I think Eric Bledsoe's probably coming back. Brogdon's essentially a point guard, really a combo guard in their system. But I think if you can get a guy who's going to be a good locker room player, a good shooter, if you need him to come in, he's going to be ready. That's something you can know about Ty Jerome. The NBA speed is going to be an adjustment. He's not really a good athlete in terms of running and jumping. He's pretty fluid with the ball, but again, not going to break a lot of guys' ankles or anything like that. So I think Milwaukee would be a good fit. I don't think San Antonio would be a bad place to go. I know Dejounte Murray is coming back, but they're rebuilding. So if you can get a guy like Ty Jerome at 29, you know, why not? I have them going somewhere else. I have the Spurs picking Talen Horton-Tucker that spot instead, but that wouldn't be a bad pick for the Spurs to get Ty Jerome. You know, after Ty Jerome, I think Ty Jerome's probably the last point guard who I would expect really to be a first rounder. The next point guard that I have in my general rankings is Kai Bowman out of Boston College. And if people don't know, Kai Bowman was a DB recruit to Alabama for football, got an offer there, decided to go to North Carolina, or had an offer to play both at North Carolina, I think, decides to go to Boston College, where he, from day one, was one of the toughest covers in the ACC. And most of that had to do with his quickness, but also just he played like a football player. And a lot of times you think of like those football guys who just can't play football or can't play basketball. They're just too physical. Their movements are just not fluid. But he played like a DB in basketball. Moved his feet incredibly well on both ends, really. Ball handling and defensively. And he's just tenacious. He's a short guard, but if you get Kai Bowman, your team picks Kai Bowman, you're going to get a guy who you can believe is going to compete. Like, when you look at a guy like Fred VanVleet, I think his competitive edge really comes from his willingness to put his nose in there and go up against anybody. I think Kai Bowman kind of has that type of toughness in him. So I think that's going to be huge. But to me, I just want to make sure that he can continue to make outside jump shots, because at Boston College, he was a guy who, he can make a lot of tough shots. He made a lot of contested threes. But if you put him taking 5 threes around the perimeter, I wouldn't have him ranked that high compared to some of these other point guards. He's not a knockdown shooter. He's not really necessarily a great one-on-one scorer, but he has a good burst and he can get by guys. So the thing with him is, if he can get you in transition, or if he can get you coming downhill off a screen. That's why I think the NBA is going to be a little easier for Kai Bowman, because number one, he won't be hassled to be the guy as he was last year. Obviously, in 2017-2018 season, he had Jerome Robinson, which made it much easier because both of them could play off each other. But last season, it was just Kai Bowman, and teams could just say, we got to stop Kai. In the NBA, he's going to have these ball screens coming, and instead of getting doubled right away, which he probably won't, he's going to be able to turn the corner hard, and he's going to have a big that he'll have to beat. Now, the bigs will be more athletic than your everyday ACC big, but Kai Bowman is crazy quick, and he's strong, and he's the type of guy who will make those adjustments. And I think it was a smart decision for him to leave. We'll talk about that with some of the other guys later on, but for Kai Bowman, what is going back to college going to do for you? He can go back and get his degree, so I don't ever think that's an issue, but he didn't really have that much to prove going back to college. So Kai Bowman is a guy, right now I have him going a little later than his actual ranking, right? I have him as 36 overall, and I think really for Kai Bowman, he could go undrafted and still make a team without a 2-year contract. I mean, just getting signed, because he's going to be showing guys that defensive toughness, that pitbull mentality. But I think he'll make it in the league. Now, the next player I'm going to talk about kind of, I really didn't think he was going to end up staying in the draft, and that's Jalen LeCue out of Brewster Academy. So similar to guys like Thon Macher and Anthony Simmons, he just went to prep school, so he did that additional year and didn't need to go to college if he didn't want to, because he already had, according to the rules, that 1 year out of high school. So Jalen LeCue has, I say this, and it's not to say they're the same person, but he has Russell Westbrook-esque athleticism. Just a freak. Look up a Jalen LeCue mixtape, and you're going to be thrown off with how explosive he is. He's the type of athlete that NBA teams want to have on every position. I mean, he could just take off. He dunks just like Russell Westbrook, and he's about 6'4", 190 pounds. I'm pretty sure he's going to get stronger. And he can just take off. Great transition player. But my thing with Jalen LeCue is, what about everything else? Because you see how good of an athlete he is. And he is the type of athlete where he can say a couple possessions a game, I'm just going to put my head down and I'm going to get to the rim. Doesn't matter who's there. I'm 6'4", I'm strong. If you let me get to that launching pad, it's over with. But my issue is a lot of those kind of fine-tuned skills, even something as simple as shooting, right? Jalen LeCue is an inconsistent shooter at this point. He's not a guy who I would even guard from the three-point line if I'm playing against them. But you have to still look at his potential. And he's going to get drafted purely on potential. I feel like he may have gotten a first-round promise. I don't know. He's got first-round potential. But I think his potential is a lot higher than what he actually has to show right now. And he did well at the Combine. He was impressive at the Combine. But his handle sometimes isn't as fast as he wants to move, and that can lead to problems. He's a solid passer. I think his vision is better than his actual passing instincts, if that makes sense. He can see a lot of the floor, but he doesn't really right now know how to find guys right on time. He's good at driving and finding cutters, finding shooters. But that's kind of, to me, step one of being a good playmaker. I think there's more than that. And some of those intricacies he doesn't have locked in right now. So I think Jalen McHugh is a guy who could go as high as like 25 or 24. I don't know. But I could also see him falling to like mid-40s. And I think my most recent mock draft, I had him going at 35 to the Hawks. You know, you got that many picks, as Atlanta does. I can go get a guy like Jalen McHugh, and it's not an issue. It's not really risk. It's low risk, high reward. If he gets picked in the second round, some team could be really happy. And if he turns out, you know, he needs some time in the G League, that's all right. It's a second-round pick. Now, don't expect him going in the lottery. That would be a stretch, but again, I had him, you know, top 40 or so prospects overall. And then after him, I think in terms of point guards, I like Jalen Hands. He didn't really take off, I don't think, as much as people expected. But part of that to me was also the fact that UCLA was just overly disappointing. There were so many other things about UCLA basketball other than Jalen Hands that just made it a disappointing season. From off the court stuff, people talking about who the coach is going to be. It was just a lot. So Jalen Hands, probably most remembered now for this season, for when Moses Brown, I don't know if he turned the ball over, missed a shot or whatever, was hanging his head, and Jalen Hands came over and said, that's just not going to happen, lifted his chin up and let him know that, you know, he had to move on from that. But Jalen Hands, I thought, had a good season. He can shoot the ball. He's going to be a better NBA player than he was in college. Let me just say that first of all. He can shoot the ball, but he was inconsistent. But I think he's the type of guy, from what I've seen, who can go on stretches as a shooter. And he's streaky. I mean, he's still only a sophomore, not a knockdown shooter at all, not anywhere near the Darius Garlands or Kobe Whites or Ty Jerome's. But he can shoot it a little bit. And he's actually a really special passer. And this is something people didn't get to see enough of because UCLA, like I said, was getting torn apart for so many other things. He can light it up when he's coming off of screens. But what he did a good job of this year is making sure that playmaking was kind of his first thing. So last year I felt like he tried to be an elite scorer and set himself up to be a one and done, which he could have tried. But this year he really focused on kind of letting the game come to him. And when you had talented guys, they didn't have a good season, but they had talent around them. Chris Wilkes, you know, Moses Brown, you know, Cody Riley's a solid player. They had guys, and he found them, and he made their lives easier. And I think as a point guard, when you go into that second year, and this is for college, this is for high school, this is definitely for the NBA. But when you go to that second year, things start to slow down for you. And things started to slow down for Jalen Hands. And I think that was a huge difference. A huge, huge difference for Jalen Hands. And now going into the draft, we're going to see if that's going to really change things. Because I don't think a lot of people are that high on him. He's very slight. I'd like to see him be more consistent as a scorer and shooter in general. He still turns the ball over a good amount, but he had the ball in his hands a lot. I really like Jalen Hands' athleticism. I thought when he was coming out of Foothills Christian that he was going to be an immediate one and done. I think I had him rated as a first-round prospect before his freshman season because I loved the way that he pushed the pace and the way that he could pass and shoot it. Now, it never really got to that point during his time at UCLA, but we'll see if he gets put in the right spot. I think maybe some time in the G League would help. I don't think he's a guy who's going to be starting in the next 2 or 3 years or anything like that, but he's really worth taking in the second round. I think mid-second round is probably where he's likely to be taken, and I think that's probably about right from what he showed at UCLA at least. And now the next point guard who I think, you know, to me might be the last point guard who gets picked, and that's Shamori Pons. So that would only be about, 9 point guards who would get taken. I like Shamori Pons out of St. John's. primarily because, similar to what I was talking about with Kai Bowman and Carson Edwards, is I really like undersized point guards who don't let you think that they're undersized. Like, Shamari Pons plays like he's 6'6", and nobody's going to stop him at the rim. And he plays with such a chip on his shoulder, and this is a guy who kind of flirted with being an early departure from St. John's. Used to play with Marcus Levert when he was a freshman, and he just continued to get better. Shamari Pons is not a big guy, and I think that's going to be the main knock against him. He's only about 6'1". He plays pretty solid defense, but it's just a level of, I wonder what Shamari Pons' like greatest asset is. I think his quickness is high level. I would say that's a plus skill for him. But his size isn't great. He's not necessarily an exceptional shooter. He could go on runs, but he's not a knockdown shooter by any means. And he's not a phenomenal playmaker. He just does a lot of things well. And, again, I think he'll figure it out. I think he's a guy who, similar to a Jalen Hands or Jalen LeCue, might need some time in the G League. But Shamari Pons is a dog, plain and simple. Like, he's tough. His stats aren't phenomenal in terms of efficiency numbers or any of that. Scored a lot of points, obviously, but wasn't an overly efficient scorer. But there was always this belief, if Shamari Pons has the ball in the last couple minutes, end the game, you need a big shot. I believe it. I'm trying to look. I don't know if there's anyone else I would be more confident in taking those late game shots on the point guard list. And that's the honest truth. Carson Edwards was big in late game shots, but Shamari Pons just has that focus and that ability to just flip switch. So I think that might be what gets him on a roster or gets him selected in the draft even, which I think would be a phenomenal thing for him. St. John's doesn't have a ton of draft picks really, so that would be big. But now after that, I'm just going to talk briefly about the other point guards who were in the draft, because some of these guys could get picked. A lot of them are going to be on Summer League rosters, so you're going to see them. So if you see their names on your Summer League team, you'll at least know a little bit about them. You see they get signed. Lindell Wigington is a guy who I don't really think got everything that he wished for at Iowa State, because last year there were some people who were saying Lindell could be a first-round pick if he left. He had a breakout. You know, it's hard to have a breakout when it's a freshman year, but he was way better as a freshman than really anybody would have expected. I think he averaged like 15 or so points a game, was just putting up buckets all over the place, did a decent job making plays, showed enough potential, you know, kind of doing the little things to make you think, wow, this guy might be ready to be in the NBA. But now he goes back for year number 2 and is hurt. And when he comes back, he's essentially a sixth man. And I never really was sure if he was totally back. He had a lot of inconsistency shooting the ball. The volume wasn't where it was or where you'd expect it to be. In the games where it was high, it wasn't really looking as natural as you would expect. Because usually that sophomore jump is a big difference, especially for those freshmen who go back. So, like, when I'm looking at guys like Trey Jones and Ashton Higgins, I'm expecting them to have huge seasons. And to an extent, you could say Lindell Wigington regressed. And I don't even think he's going to be selected this year. But he's a guy, if he's fully healthy, who can create his own shot and is a strong 6'2". Not a big guard, but he's strong. And I think he's going to play with a certain level of attitude because he probably feels he should be rated higher than he is. So I think he's going to be a guy to look out for on summer league teams. And another name that I'd like to talk about is Jared Harper from Auburn. This is a guy I thought there was no shot he was leaving because he's listed at 5'11". I'm still convinced the dude's like my height. He's probably like 5'9". But he was very wildly all over the place as a freshman and sophomore in terms of making shots. And then this year, especially even early on, like Thanksgiving tournaments and the holiday tournaments, Jared Harper was making a case for being a top 5 point guard in the country. And I would say by the end of the year, Jared Harper was a top 5 point guard in college basketball because he took on such a load every day. Every game they played, Jared Harper was the focus of scouting reports because he would create off the dribble. He would find the guys he needed to find. And then at the end of games, I think he was a guy I said was the closer of the year in the country because it didn't matter who was on him. It didn't matter, what the stakes were. If it's the end of a game, give the ball to Jared Harper and get out of the way because he can hit threes now. As a freshman and sophomore, he wasn't a sniper by any means. And he's not really, a spot-up shooter necessarily. But off the bounce, he can make some rhythm threes. And he's just so dynamic with the ball. And he's built really weird, too. I mean, he's like 5'11", but I feel like his legs are like 5'9" of him. Like really long legs. And defensively, he just competes. And he's a pest, and I think that's what's going to help him as he gets to the NBA. And I forgot, some people gave him some comparisons to some other miniature guards. I think he needs more of a consistent jump shot to find a spot. But he's very similar to me to another guy, Tremont Waters from LSU. Just another guy, pretty much the same size. Tremont Waters is built I think a little stockier, but they're pretty much the same height. And Tremont Waters is a defensive, like, A-plus defender. He gets steals all the time. He's a hound. He made guys uncomfortable in the SEC, which is really one of the top conferences for basketball. He just made other guards uncomfortable because his hands were always around the ball. And he moves his feet incredibly well. And the role of pest is one that should not be underappreciated. And it's not just guys like Patrick Beverly. If you look at the playoff teams, right? If you look at the Bucks, Eric Bledsoe is about 6 foot, 6'1", all defensive team. If you look at the Warriors, Steph's not an elite defender. They're kind of a special case because they got plus defenders all around. But the Raptors, Kyle Lowry, Fred VanVleet, great defenders. Most of these teams have, if you're going to be a short guard, first of all, you got to be able to be a pest. That's just plain and simple. That's how I feel. But Tremont Waters has that ability to guard the ball. And even though he's not a great shooter, he's a good passer. If you bring him in on the other side and you have him go through some ball screens, I'm confident Tremont Waters in the NBA will still be able to find guys, throw good lob passes and all that. He threw a lot to Emmett Williams and Nas Reed. But I don't think he'll get picked either. I think I still had Tremont in my top 100, but kind of towards the back end. Now, there's a couple seniors who I think really had stocks that were quite volatile throughout their careers, and that's Curran Roach out of Texas and Jalen Adams out of UConn. Now, for different reasons. Curran Roach had to deal with a number of issues kind of off the court. But it was always like he was super athletic, right? He's a great athlete. But I was always wondering, like, what else? Because defensively, especially playing under Shaka Smart, you have to be able to guard the ball. And he's a solid defender. And he's 6'4". This is a big point guard. But he's still pretty skinny. And I just never felt like his pick and roll skills or his ability to shoot off the bounce really took off. Like, when I'm looking at a senior, especially as a point guard, I'm looking for senior point guards who are not necessarily finished products, but, like, ready to play. And I wouldn't say Curran Roach is any further along than the other guys that I talked about. And those are all underclassmen. So I think he's really going to need to figure out if overseas is a better option or if he's in the G League. how can I use my athleticism in different ways? Like, can I be an elite offensive rebounder? Or can I just do a better job of consistently defending? Like, am I going to be a 90-foot defender? Is that how I'm going to make my money? He's just got to figure that out. Jalen Adams, injuries all over the place last 2 seasons. And you hate to see it because Jalen Adams is a good player. And he's a guy who, after his sophomore season, I looked at as a guy who would be one of the 100 best prospects. And I've had him right around there the last 2 years. But he keeps getting hurt. And UConn obviously has not been good, so you haven't really seen or heard much about it. But Jalen Adams has been like the best player on that team for the last couple years. And he's a talented 6'3" guard. He can shoot the ball with time. But he's a good playmaker. He's a little bit of an all-around guy. Will rebound the ball for you. And he's a guy who's difficult to stay in front of, too, even at 6'3". So I just wish he had some better luck in terms of injuries. But Jalen Adams, similar to Kerr and Roach, I think Jalen Adams is more polished. I think if he's healthy, he'll have no problem getting on a G League team. But we'll have to see. And now the other senior, or actually junior, who I want to talk about before I get to the couple seniors from mid-majors, is DeMarcus Simmons from Georgia State. Now, this is a guy who had a phenomenal year last year. He did a great job, and I'm talking about the 2017-2018 season. Was just tough to handle, led them to the NCAA tournament, all that. And then this year, I just really felt like there was a disconnect with his shot making. When I watch tape of DeMarcus Simmons, he's a guy who's so explosive. Like, this is a guy who I'm pretty sure can just dunk. No step, no drop step, just off vert. Could just dunk. And he can make those tough fall-away threes, step back, side steps, all that. But he just didn't really make them enough. And he's a guy who, when I look at him, I think DeMarcus Simmons has enough talent to be above guys like Tremont Waters and Jared Harper. I just think the lack of consistency this season is going to hurt him a little bit. If you just watch him in warm-up lines, you'll be blown away. Because he can get up. He's not a short guard. He's about 6'3", but he's got good length. He finishes with a lot of flair. He plays with a lot of passion. A good shot-blocking guard. Should be able to defend. I think he's a guy who's going to be able to guard both ones and twos, no problem. And he's a guy who I think, at the end of the day, teams are going to want to look at, regardless of whether or not he gets drafted. I would see him getting a phone call very soon after the draft. And you'd love to see it work out for him. Georgia State, not a big school. Obviously, R.J. Hunter's the last guy to be picked from there. But DeMarcus Simmons has taken them to the tournament the last 2 years, and he's got some ability. Now, the first international guard who I think has any shot of really getting picked, like I said, this is not a great point guard class. William McDowell-White from Australia, thought he might leave last year. It's kind of just a tempo, I would call him like a tempo point guard. He's about 6'5", fundamental and tough. If you come from Australia, you can pretty much guess that at this point. But William McDowell-White, same way. He was at the Hoop Summit a couple years ago. I think his athleticism makes it difficult for him to be an easily projectable NBA player. But what I love is that you can tell how smart he is. And because of that, he's going to give himself a shot. So I won't count him out. He's not going to get picked. But he's also a guy, the deadline's coming up. He's also a guy that might not end up going in the draft in the first place. Might pull away and decide to wait another year, go through free agency if he doesn't get picked. Now, everyone else, really, for the most part, point guard-wise, that I really want to talk about are seniors. And one of them is Chris Clemens, who is the shortest point guard who I at least consider to be a legit prospect. Led the nation in scoring out of Campbell. Can pretty much do everything you would expect out of those short point guards. If you look in the past, guys like Kay Felder, did this. Even Isaiah Thomas when he was in college, kind of the same type of build, kind of shot making is similar in terms of how they create their open looks. I don't think Chris Clemens will get picked, but he's going to give guys buckets in Summer League, so believe that. It's just I don't know if he's enough of a shooter. I don't think his IQ's up to where a guy like Isaiah Thomas's was. But as a short guy, I'd love to see him make it, so best of luck to Chris. And then C.J. Massenberg out of Buffalo. Get another big guard out of a mid-major, about 6'3"-ish. Really showed out when they beat Arizona last year. So he was the most consistent Buffalo player. He's been there all 4 years. Was a solid contributor. You could always trust C.J. Massenberg in games in the MAC. And, I think he's going to need to go through the Summer League route as well. I don't think he'll be an immediate signee. Some of these guys will be. I think like Jared Harper, Tremont Waters might be a guy who gets signed right off the bat. I think C.J. Massenberg may just get an invite to a summer camp and then have to prove his way. But he's capable of it. Now, Phil Booth out of Nova is a guy who I don't really think many expected to be a draft prospect. I didn't, at least. He always seemed like one of those like solid college point guards, but not necessarily a guy who would, step out and make any big moves. But, we'll see. Give him a shot. Had a good senior season. Hard to count him out. A couple other mid-major guys. John Elmore out of Marshall. I liked him a lot more last year. I thought this year he didn't really take that step. Pulled off the upset last year, actually, in the tournament. But John Elmore is more or less what I said I thought Phil Booth was, which is a very good college point guard and a guy who I think is going to make a killing overseas if he wants to. I think it'll be more difficult to play in the G League. I think he could make way more money overseas, and the systems there might benefit him more. But, whatever he wants to do works. He's not going to be picked, won't be signed right away. And I think overseas is 90% likely to me where he'll end up. Another mid-major guy is Tyler Hall out of Montana State. The first time I heard about him was when he was a sophomore. So he stayed all 4 years. But when he was a sophomore, kind of for being a wiry type, he's about 6'4", like a $175. Could score it. Became one of the better scorers in the country, one of the more consistent scorers the last 3 years. And, guys like that always kind of give you a shot to make it, make a team, be on a two-way, because they kind of have a skill that's translatable. And Tyler Hall can score. A matter of physicality and, obviously, competition. He played at Montana State. They didn't play a lot of great teams. So it'll be interesting to see how he performs or how he has performed in workouts to this point. But other than that, there's not a ton of guys who I think are really going to make a lot of noise. I think the only junior who I didn't really talk about a lot is Lamar Peters from Mississippi State. He left early. He was at a point as a freshman when people were talking about him going into his sophomore year as a first-round pick. And I just never really saw it. I could be totally wrong, but I just personally never saw it. So we'll see what happens with Lamar if he actually gets